additionally that you see with this colonial perception and reaction, imperial perception and reaction of this is going to be something different. Once mercantilism rather becomes imperial policy, you see the British then start to put the aspects of the state controls in place to make this happen. They essentially try to unify royal control over these colonies. Under James II, they establish what is known as the Dominion of New England, which lasts for all of 2 years, 1686 to 1688. What James II does is he revokes all the charters of all the New England colonies and essentially tries to unify a system of command and control over all of these colonies here from New York upwards, and says we're going to dissolve your borders essentially for governmental administrative purposes and make you all one colony answerable to one person. And that one person was the royal governor of this overall polyglot that the king appointed, James II. He appointed Edmund Andros. Andros instantly makes himself completely unpopular by ignoring the colonial charters, suspending a lot of the colonial courts and their laws, violating colonial contracts, and restricting colonial trade, towing the line with what the king wanted. But if you link this back to Bacon's Rebellion, you're going to have this idea of resentment, colonial resentment of distant authority kind of showing up in this high-handed manner and voiding the old order of doing things. And so he was unpopular because of his taxes, because of the way that he restricted the trade, the active enforcement of these laws that he went after, and the dissolving of the town meetings in Massachusetts, etc., taking away the local governance that the colonials had been used to since their inception and founding. Well, this only lasts for all of 2 years, because after 2 years of James II's rule in England, there is the so-called Glorious Revolution. And in the Glorious Revolution, you have James fleeing his throne and rule reestablished by William and Mary, a new set of rulers. William and Mary of Orange come from the Netherlands to rule the English throne. And when they come in, the Dominion of New England goes away. It dissolves. Andros flees the country. And William and Mary have no pressing, urgent desire to see this placed back into law. However, even though the Dominion of New England is gone, many of the Trade and Navigation Acts, in fact, virtually all of them, these economic controls, they remain in place. And this is the beginning of this gradual erosion of another AP history word, an important term, the gradual erosion of an idea called salutary neglect. When our colonies were first set up, if you go back to what you've learned already, it's two places. You had Plymouth or Massachusetts, Boston, and you had Jamestown in Virginia. Two very small, tiny little dots on a map, right? When they were these small, insignificant little blips on a map that were owned or that were occupied by a couple hundred Englishmen who weren't that popular with the king anyway. They were debtors, they were losers, they were second-borns, they were religious fanatics, at least that's the way the king saw them. When those people were over there, if you will, and these small, insignificant blips, the king had no real interest in controlling them because there's nothing of value to do. The royal government in England had no real interest. They was just glad to see him gone. Over time, though, as these colonies grew, they generate a lot of wealth, and as they generate that wealth and become increasingly valuable to the empire, the British government, the British state becomes more and more interested in seeing that wealth is channeled and directed and controlled through the ways we've talked about in this lesson thus far. So this original idea of salutary neglect, where the colonies were left alone to make their own decisions, that starts to get chipped away at bit by bit by bit by bit. And the one thing that people discover about making their own decisions is you like making your own decisions. And once you get to do that, to kind of reel that back in, gets an awful lot harder to do. And it's going to generate we're setting the stage now for linkage of generating an awful lot of ill will and feelings that come further on down the line in multiple lessons that we'll look at. The final aspect of this colonial America and the British Empire that we're going to talk about in this unit, during this restoration phase, this is when slavery becomes sort of permanently enmeshed and codified into the colonial structure and way of doing things. The causal origins of slavery are threefold, some of which I'm sure you're quite familiar with. The immigration decline from the old world meant that this was a permanently labor-starved region, and the immigration decline you had in terms of eligible people to be indentured servants was going to deplete itself, so you need someone to pick up that slack. Secondly, there's economic and cost considerations in terms of every time you have an indentured servant, and the indentured servant either dies, runs away, or gains the end of his contract, his freedom, you got to start this process as a landowner all over again. And with slavery, if you can make it perpetual, it's a far more economically efficient model to use. And the first steps in this hardening of slave law into this pattern come in the 1660s, right in the heart of this restoration period. What happens is slavery begins to become legally perpetual. In other words, slavery begins to become something that gets extended on a permanent legal basis. It might have been informally done in some colonies, but on a permanent legal written down basis, extended intergenerationally through the generations, from mothers to children, to children, to children, to children, as a permanent class distinction barrier that you could never get out of. You could never buy your way out of it. You could never work off your contract as an indenture could. And you begin to have laws in the colonies, one by one, being put in place that restrict slave rights, increase the master's rights, and turn the slaves increasingly into a property or a chattel property, a property class of individuals being treated as property. This culminates then with the large-scale development of what we're going to reference as the triangular trade, which for hopefully quite a few of you, hopefully is something that you referenced at least in middle school and maybe beyond there. There's two triangles you see here. We're going to focus on this triangle at first as being the key element of the triangular trade. Triangular trade worked in this order. New England, remember we said New England was the depot. It was the warehouse, if you will. It was the shipbuilding transportation hub center. From New England, rum. And I could start anywhere, I'm simply starting New England, but it's a cycle. Rum was distilled, which was then shipped to West Africa. From West Africa, this rum was then exchanged or transferred for slaves who went on the so-called Middle Passage to the West Indies. Those slaves in the West Indies were dropped off on the sugar plantations. Some were dropped off, obviously, in the Carolinas and for sugar plantations as well, and more for rice and tobacco plantations. But they were dropped off here at these sugar plantations, at which point the cane sugar was grown by this slave labor, and this cane sugar was then transported in the form of molasses northward to Boston, where it was distilled in the rum, and hence you've got your triangle going around and around and around and around and around. Now, between the New England colonies and England, there was sort of a triangle of trade, which is actually more like a parallel track of trade that we've talked about on the mercantilist model. If I break off my map model for a moment, what would I have? I would have a model where raw materials and fruit and lumber and goods went to England, okay, as part of the mercantilist model, along with tobacco, along with furs, along with hides, along with any items of value of the mercantilist model, went to England. And in return, what did England send back? Finished goods. And you can see how, if you think a little bit of basic economics, this really works to England's advantage. Because think about what costs more. 500 pound, a ton and a half of steel, or an automobile that ton and a half of steel is made out of. What costs more? A couple 2x4s or some planks and boards, or a finished piece of furniture that's a fine cabinet that comes out of it. The value-added goods are always worth more. So when England is getting the raw materials shipped here into its workshops, into its factories, they turn those goods into stuff that are worth way, way more, which then they sell back at a tidy profit to the colonials, who are, as we've just learned, forbidden from making these things on their own. So it's a captive collective audience for them. So the notion of imperialism as an imperial policy is going to generate a little bit of friction. It starts small, but it's going to grow over time. Just as with salutary neglect, that starts small. There's not a lot of friction at first, but increasing colonial oversight and constraint on the political level, along with increasing colonial limitation on the economic level, is going to make for an environment that's going to cause some real problems down the road that will link back to this lesson when we look at future lessons.